Okay, my speech is to commemorate the singer and songwriter known as Robert Zimmerman, or as many of you may know, Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan was born in 1941 on May 24th as Robert Allen Zimmerman, who later adopted the stage name Bob Dylan. He was born to a set of Jewish parents, and his grandparents were Lithuanian. And he grew up in a very tight-knit community that had a great sense of family values and camaraderie. And within this, he played lots of music, and from a young age, he learned guitar, and he learned to sing on it, or sing with it. This would later pay off in great dividends for this man. But in the meantime, he went to high school at the University of Minnesota in the city, and he played in a rock and roll band. This rock and roll band, it's funny to think that Bob Dylan, knowing what we all know now, as a man who would play loud and aggressive music, but in fact, when he played at a high school talent show, the principal shut down his performance of his band because they were too loud and too aggressive and too edgy for the high school audience. Well, once he graduated high school, he went to the University of Minnesota for about a year. He was really not a person that was much for formal education or classical learning. He was a free spirit and really wanted to pioneer and play music rather than sit in a classroom all day. While he played rock and roll in much of his high school career, he eventually drifted away from it and started playing folk music. And in his words, he felt that rock and roll, while it was very popular for the time, he felt that it was too processed, too popular, and there was too much unnatural influence on all of it. Too many producers sculpting albums, and he found that folk music was a much more realistic and down-to-earth approach to music. Well, in 1962, when he was only about 21 years old, he released his first album as a folk album. The problem with this album was that because it was a folk album, it was not publicized very well. There was nothing wrong with the content per se. It was a very good album, and now it's even revered as his, this was his first real effort as a musician. But overall, it was very mediocre, and it only sold 5,000 units in its first year. As a result of this, he dropped the name Bob Dylan and decided to start calling himself various other stage names to give potential audiences sort of a fresh new slate in which to judge him. And one of his stage names was Bob Landy. By this time, in the mid-'60s, rock and roll was in full swing, and while many people see the 60s as a nostalgic time of a flourish of culture and all sorts of Americana that we would now grow to love, it was a very turbulent time as well. You had the sexual revolution, you had the hippie movement, and you had the Vietnam War. Well, Bob Dylan, in his second album, The Free Will and Bob Dylan, really capitalized on this. A lot of his songs were very involved with politics and social commentary, and as a result of that, there was a lot of media attention surrounding it. Even though it was a folk album, it was something that people really identified with and people were able to get a hold of. And as a result of that, he really became popular at this point. Throughout the 60s and 70s, he made many songs that we all now know almost by heart. They have The Times They Are Changing in 64, they have Like a Rolling Stone in 65, All Along the Watchtower, Knocking on Heaven's Door, Tangled Up in Blue, and did many, many collaborations with the Canadian ensemble known as The Band. It's strange, though, to think about Bob Dylan, though, because he was a folk singer, and a lot of the songs that he wrote were moderately successful, but somehow contributed to the overall picture of what rock and roll and what popular music in America was like. A very good example of this was All Along the Watchtower. This was a song that he had released. Nobody really paid attention to it. and then Jimi Hendrix started to play it, and he brought it up to sort of a more electric level, a more rock and roll level, and a more chaotic take on it. And as a result of this, the song became hugely popular. And this is almost sort of plagued Bob Dylan throughout his years. Of he would do a song that had all the very good necessary components of a great song, but for whatever reason there wasn't quite the interest around it. Knocking on Heaven's Door is another one. Eric Clapton and Guns N' Roses both did covers of it to great popularity. If you really wanted to kind of think about it, in some ways he was almost sort of a ghostwriter. People were covering his songs and were being more successful than he ever did with his songs. And this sort of brings us into his whole style and maybe why he was not as, well, as he was not as massively popular as some of his counterparts. He sang folk music, which was not as popular as rock and roll at the time. He had a very, very limited range in his singing. He sung within maybe about an octave. By no means, from a classical stance, was he at all a good singer or songwriter. His stuff was very, very basic, and if he went to school for it, he would have had a very, very hard time passing any of his potential classes, because his stuff was so basic and rudimentary, and he had so many bad habits in his play style and in his singing style. I mean, this was a guy who, while he sang and played guitar at the same time, he didn't even use full chords. He would tune his guitar so all 6 strings, he wouldn't have his hands on the guitar, and he would strum all 6 strings, and he had it tuned so that was a chord. So all he had to do was slide his hand up and down without doing any fancy maneuvers. I mean, this was a guy that there's no reason any of his music should have ever been successful. It was, in a lot of ways, so cookie-cutter and so mediocre that it's mind-blowing to think that he ever became popular. But he did. And as a result of that, he's reeled in 13 Grammys. He's been in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He was one of the first people to be inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Last year, he got the Nobel Prize for Literature, which nobody has ever done as a musician in that category. It was always poets and people who have done written works, but never somebody who had sang. And both Princeton University and the St. Andrews College in Scotland both made him honorary doctors in literature and music, respectively. It's a strange, strange thing to look at Bob Dylan, because he has contributed so much to Americana and so much to our culture, yet in a lot of ways he wasn't as popular as he perhaps should have been. But because he was basic, it appealed to a lot of people. It appealed to a very simple and sensible people who were not really won over by grandiose displays of music. And as a result of that, he's left an influence and an imprint on America that really can never ever be erased. In conclusion, this is a man who's been producing music for half a century and is absolutely perennial. He never really seems to ever go away. He's always somehow relevant. He's even made it into all of the various aspects of pop culture, like The Watchmen, where the comic book and the movie both use much of his music as sort of a commentary on the time in which this country was that the movie was set. In a lot of ways, he has the it factor. A man that, on the surface, you really can't figure out why anybody liked him, but here he is, and he sold over 100 million records as a result of it. So that's why I think that it's worthy to commemorate the 71 years that Bob Dylan has been alive on this earth, because he's given us all a great gift of music, enjoyment, that really can never be matched. Thank you.